What we're about to tell you is the story of 3 sentences that brought a room full of world leaders to complete silence, turned a global summit upside down, and made even the most powerful man in America question his own words. It's about a moment when dignity faced down arrogance, when quiet strength overwhelmed loud noise, and when the world witnessed what happens when someone finally says what everyone was thinking, but nobody dared to speak. This isn't just about politics or diplomacy. It's about the moment when truth cut through pretense like a blade through silk, leaving everyone breathless and asking themselves, what does real power actually look like? The marble floors of the Geneva International Conference Center had seen their share of history. Presidents had walked these halls, treaties had been signed in these rooms, and the fate of nations had been decided behind these golden doors. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the building for what was about to unfold on this crisp October morning. The Global Development Forum was the kind of event where champagne cost more than most people's monthly salaries, where handshakes were worth billions, and where the phrase global responsibility was thrown around like confetti at a wedding. It was theater, really. Elaborate, expensive theater where everyone knew their lines and played their parts with practiced precision. Security was tighter than a bank vault. Metal detectors, X-ray machines, and enough armed guards to occupy a small country. Every entrance was monitored, every guest was screened, and every conversation was probably recorded. The Swiss authorities weren't taking any chances with this gathering of global power. Inside the main auditorium, crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across rows of perfectly arranged seats. The stage was set with a U-shaped table draped in pristine white cloth, crystal water glasses positioned with military precision, and microphones tested to audio perfection. This was where the world's most influential voices would discuss the future of international aid, global development, and what they like to call shared prosperity. The guest list read like a who's who of global influence. Finance ministers from G7 nations, development bank presidents, pharmaceutical company CEOs, and tech billionaires who'd made their fortunes while half the world still lacked internet access. They mingled in the lobby, exchanging business cards and pleasantries, while photographers captured their every smile and handshake. But there were 2 men in that room who didn't quite fit the typical mold of Geneva diplomacy. The first was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. At 35, he was young by presidential standards, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen his share of struggle. He didn't arrive with the usual presidential entourage. No fleet of black SUVs, no army of advisors whispering in his ear, no press secretary managing his image. He came quietly, almost invisibly, wearing his characteristic deep green military uniform instead of the expensive suits that filled the room. Traoré had risen to power through a coup that removed a government many saw as too cozy with foreign interests. His anti-colonial rhetoric and calls for African sovereignty had made him a hero to some and a threat to others. Western governments watched him nervously, unsure whether he was a reformer or a revolutionary. What they all agreed on was that he was unpredictable, and unpredictability made diplomats very, very nervous. The second man was Donald Trump, former and current president of the United States. He entered the building like he owned it, which, given America's influence in global institutions, wasn't entirely metaphorical. Red tie, perfectly styled hair, and that unmistakable swagger that had dominated American politics for nearly a decade. His entourage filled 2 elevators: Secret Service agents, policy advisors, media handlers, and the kind of people whose job it was to make sure their boss always looked like the most important person in any room. Trump's relationship with Africa had always been complicated. His previous comments about the continent had caused diplomatic headaches for years, and his approach to foreign aid was transactional at best. He saw international assistance as leverage, a tool to extract concessions and ensure compliance. To him, aid wasn't charity, it was investment with expected returns. The morning panels had gone according to script. Prepared remarks about sustainable development goals, carefully worded commitments to continued partnership, and the kind of diplomatic language that said everything and nothing simultaneously. The audience, a mix of government officials, NGO, representatives and journalists, nodded politely and took notes that would probably never be read again. But the main event was scheduled for 2 p.m. Global Responsibility and the Future of Aid. This was the panel everyone had come to see, featuring heads of state and development leaders discussing the next decade of international cooperation. The moderator, a veteran Swiss diplomat named Klaus Müller, had moderated similar discussions for 20 years. He thought he'd seen everything. He was wrong. As the lunch break ended and delegates filed back into the auditorium, there was an electricity in the air that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the confluence of personalities. Maybe it was the weight of global challenges demanding real solutions. Or maybe it was simply time for someone to say what needed to be said. Trump took his seat at the center of the U-shaped table, flanked by European leaders who maintained diplomatic distance while projecting collaborative warmth for the cameras. To his left sat Emmanuel Macron of France, Olaf Scholz of Germany, and Giorgia Meloni of Italy. To his right were the leaders of Canada, Japan, and Australia, all perfectly positioned, all impeccably dressed, all ready to deliver their prepared talking points. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the far end of the table, almost isolated from the main cluster of Western leaders. It wasn't accidental. Seating arrangements at these events were calculated down to the inch. His position was symbolic, present but peripheral, included but not central. It was a subtle reminder of the power dynamics that governed international relations. The moderator cleared his throat and began with the usual pleasantries. Distinguished leaders, honored guests, we gather today to discuss one of the most critical challenges facing our global community. How do we ensure that international development assistance creates lasting, sustainable change while respecting the sovereignty and dignity of recipient nations? It was the kind of question that could generate hours of discussion without producing a single concrete answer. Perfect for diplomatic settings where the goal was often to appear productive while avoiding actual commitment. The first responses were predictably safe. The Canadian Prime Minister spoke about partnership and mutual respect. The German Chancellor emphasized evidence-based development strategies. The Japanese Prime Minister discussed technological innovation for global good. Each statement was polished, measured, and completely forgettable. Then Klaus Müller turned to Donald Trump. Mr. President, the United States remains the world's largest provider of foreign aid. How do you see America's role in global development moving forward? Trump leaned into his microphone, and something shifted in the room. The practiced diplomacy, the careful language, the measured responses, all of it was about to get blown apart. You know what, Klaus? Let's just cut through all this diplomatic nonsense for a minute, Trump began, his voice carrying that familiar edge that had defined his political career. Everyone in this room knows the truth, but nobody wants to say it. He stood up, pushing back his chair with more force than necessary. The scraping sound echoed through the suddenly silent auditorium. We've given Africa more money than any continent in history. Schools, hospitals, roads, clean water, food aid, you name it, we've paid for it. And not just us Americans, but everyone sitting at this table. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians. We've all poured trillions of dollars into Africa over the past 50 years. The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that this wasn't going according to the scheduled format. Mr. President, perhaps we could discuss specific programs and their measurable impacts. Trump held up a hand, cutting him off. I'm not finished, because here's what nobody wants to admit. After all that money, after all that help, what do we get in return? Complaints, criticism, and frankly, disrespect. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras zoomed in on faces around the table. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated by the break from diplomatic protocol. I mean, look at this room, Trump continued, gesturing broadly. Half the infrastructure that got these leaders here today was built with Western aid money. The airports, the roads, the telecommunications networks that let them tweet their grievances about us. We paid for that. He started pacing now, building momentum like he was at a campaign rally rather than a diplomatic summit. And instead of gratitude, instead of partnership, what do we hear? Neo-colonialism, Western imperialism, structural exploitation. Give me a break. The French President Macron looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. The German Chancellor was staring intently at his notes. But Ibrahim Traoré sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Trump with an intensity that was almost physical. Some of these leaders act like they built their countries from scratch, Trump continued, his voice rising, like they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps without any help from anyone. But we all know that's not true. We handed them progress on a silver platter, and the least they could do is say thank you. He turned and looked directly at Traoré for the first time. Some of you young revolutionaries think you can just ignore the help you've received and pretend you did it all yourselves. But that's not how the world works. Success requires acknowledging the people who made it possible. The silence that followed was deafening. Not the polite quiet of diplomatic consideration, but the stunned silence of a room full of people who couldn't quite believe what they'd just heard. The moderator opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Finally, Klaus Müller found his voice. "President Traoré, would you like to respond to these comments?" Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly. No dramatic gestures, no theatrical movements. He simply rose from his chair with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Unlike Trump's pacing performance, Traoré's stillness commanded attention through pure presence. He didn't walk to the center podium. He didn't need props or staging. He stood exactly where he was, hands at his sides, and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but somehow filled every corner of the massive auditorium. "You gave us money," he began, each word measured and deliberate. "This is true." The simplicity of the opening caught everyone off guard. No diplomatic preamble, no flowery language, just a direct acknowledgement of fact. "But with every dollar," he continued, his voice growing slightly stronger, "you took our dignity." The words hit the room like a physical force. Delegates who had been checking their phones suddenly looked up. Journalists stopped typing. Even the security guards seemed to lean in closer. "And today," Traoré said, his eyes never leaving Trump's face, "I return both." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was vacuum-like, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning system. Trump's confident expression faltered for just a moment. A flicker of confusion, perhaps even surprise. He clearly hadn't expected such a direct, unflinching response. "That's very dramatic," Trump said, trying to regain his footing. "But drama doesn't change facts." But Traoré wasn't finished. He stepped closer to his microphone, his voice now carrying to every corner of the room. "Aid is not charity when it comes with chains," he said. "You build hospitals, yes, but you write our healthcare policies. You send grain, but you take our gold. You provide loans, but you own our resources. You call it help, we call it a transaction." The moderator looked desperately at his notes, searching for a way to regain control of the session. The other world leaders sat frozen, caught between diplomatic protocol and genuine fascination with this unprecedented moment. "Every road you paved came with conditions," Traoré continued. "Every school you built required us to buy your textbooks, teach your languages, adopt your systems. Every hospital you funded had to purchase your medicines, train with your methods, follow your protocols. This is not generosity, this is business." Now he did move, taking 3 deliberate steps toward the center of the U-shaped table. His military bearing was evident in every movement, controlled, purposeful, commanding. "You speak of gratitude as if we should thank the hand that feeds us while it pickpockets our children. You demand appreciation for help that always costs more than it gives. You want applause for assistance that makes us more dependent, not more free." Trump leaned toward his microphone, his face reddening slightly. "That's completely unfair. We've saved millions of lives through our aid programs. We've prevented famines, stopped epidemics, built infrastructure that—" Traoré raised one hand, not aggressively, not dismissively, but with such quiet authority that Trump's words simply stopped mid-sentence. The gesture was almost gentle, like a teacher calming an excited student, but its effect was absolute. "I do not deny that lives were saved," Traoré said. "I do not dismiss the roads or the hospitals or the schools. But I will not pretend that salvation came without a price, or that the price was fair." He paused, letting his words settle. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "Real power does not need to announce itself. It does not need to demand gratitude or list its achievements. Real power creates, empowers, and then steps back to let others flourish. What you describe is not power. It is neediness, dressed in authority." The observation was surgical in its precision. Around the table, other world leaders found themselves examining their own consciences, wondering if they too had confused control with leadership, management with empowerment. "You mock us for needing help, then design systems that ensure we always need more help. You criticize our dependence, then structure aid in ways that deepen that dependence. You complain about ingratitude while building relationships that make genuine gratitude impossible." Trump was visibly struggling now, his usual confidence replaced by the discomfort of someone unused to being intellectually outmaneuvered in public. "Look, I never said—" But Traoré continued, his rhythm now hypnotic, each phrase building on the last like waves approaching shore. The hand that gives can be generous, or it can be possessive. It can open doors, or it can create locks. It can plant seeds, or it can pull roots. You have chosen possession over generosity, locks over doors, root pulling over seed planting. The metaphors were simple enough for everyone to understand, but sophisticated enough to carry layers of meaning. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was poetry with purpose. And now you stand before the world, frustrated that your possessiveness hasn't generated love, that your locks haven't created security, that your root pulling hasn't produced gratitude. You blame us for not appreciating a gift that was never freely given. The attack was devastating precisely because it wasn't angry. Traoré's tone remained measured, almost gentle. He wasn't shouting or gesturing wildly. He was simply stating facts with the clarity of someone who had thought deeply about these issues long before this moment. For 60 years, you have told us we are children who need guidance. You have structured every interaction to confirm our dependency and your wisdom. You have built institutions designed to help us, but only in ways that keep you essential to our progress. Now the other world leaders were looking genuinely uncomfortable. Because while Traoré was speaking directly to Trump, his words applied to virtually every developed nation's approach to international aid. Then you wonder why we don't trust you. You wonder why younger leaders question your motives. You wonder why the gratitude you expected never materialized. He paused again, and in that pause, something shifted in the room. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear when Trump was speaking had completely reversed. Now Trump looked like the one being lectured, the one on the defensive. But here is what you truly cannot understand, Traoré continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow seemed louder than shouting. Dignity cannot be given. It can only be recognized or destroyed. You have spent decades destroying ours while demanding thanks for the privilege. The words hit like hammer blows, each one precisely placed for maximum impact. You gave us money, yes, but with every dollar you took dignity. You provided aid, but you extracted sovereignty. You offered help, but you demanded submission. And today, in this room, before these witnesses, I return both your money and your expectations. The final sentences came with the inevitability of sunrise, as if everything that had happened before was simply building toward this moment of absolute clarity. We no longer need your helping hand if it comes attached to a controlling arm. We no longer want your assistance if it requires our diminishment. We no longer accept your charity if the price is our dignity. And then came the 3 sentences that would break the internet, that would be quoted in history books, that would define this moment for generations to come. You gave us money, but with every dollar, you took dignity. And today, I return both. The silence that followed was beyond description. It wasn't just that people had stopped talking. It was as if the entire concept of sound had been suspended. Time seemed frozen, breath held, hearts paused between beats. Trump stood there, mouth slightly open, for perhaps the first time in his political career, completely without words. The man who had built his brand on never backing down, never admitting weakness, never conceding a point, stood silent and somehow smaller than he had been just moments before. Around the table, world leaders sat transfixed. Some looked awed, others uncomfortable, but all of them recognized they had just witnessed something unprecedented. This wasn't just a diplomatic exchange gone off script. This was a fundamental power dynamic being rewritten in real time. Audience of delegates, journalists, and observers sat in absolute stillness. Phone screens that had been flickering with social media updates now lay dark and forgotten. This was the kind of moment that demanded complete attention, the kind of confrontation that would be remembered long after the policy details were forgotten. Klaus Muller, the moderator, looked like a man watching his carefully planned dinner party spontaneously combust. He had notes prepared for every possible direction the conversation might take, but nothing had prepared him for this level of raw, unfiltered truth-telling. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, Trump attempted a response. His voice, when it came, lacked its usual conviction. That's a very interesting perspective, he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. But I think we need to look at the actual results of our aid programs, the measurable outcomes, the lives that have been improved. It was a desperate attempt to return to safer ground, to pull the conversation back toward statistics and policy, details where he might regain his footing. But the moment had passed beyond such retreats. Traoré didn't interrupt this time. He simply waited, letting Trump's words fade into the silence, demonstrating through his patience that he had no need to compete for attention or fight for space. His point had been made, and it would stand regardless of whatever response followed. When Trump finished his attempted rebuttal, Traoré spoke once more, his final words of the exchange. Numbers tell us what happened. Truth tells us why it happened. Today, I have offered truth. Tomorrow, we will create new numbers. And with that, he sat down. The moderator, recognizing that any attempt to continue the panel would be anticlimactic at best, called for a recess. But nobody moved. The delegates sat transfixed, still processing what they had witnessed. Journalists frantically tried to capture quotes and reactions, while camera operators zoomed in on faces around the room, documenting expressions of shock, admiration, discomfort, and awe. Within minutes, phone screens began lighting up across the auditorium. Social media notifications pinged incessantly as videos of the exchange began circulating. The hashtag, in return, both started trending before the moderator had even officially ended the session. Trump's staff huddled anxiously, whispering urgent conversations about damage control and response strategies. But what could they say? How do you spin a moment of such crystalline clarity, such perfect articulation of uncomfortable truths? Meanwhile, Traoré sat calmly at his seat, neither gloating over his triumph nor appearing anxious about the consequences. He looked like a man who had simply done what needed to be done, said what needed to be said, and was now ready to move on to whatever came next. As delegates began filing out of the auditorium, many stopped to shake Traoré's hand or offer quiet words of support. Others approached more tentatively, as if unsure whether association with him might carry political risks back home. A young journalist from the BBC managed to catch Traoré as he exited the building. "Mr. President," she called out, jogging too. "Keep up with his measured pace. That was an incredible confrontation in there. Are you concerned about diplomatic repercussions? Do you worry that such direct criticism might harm Burkina Faso's relationships with Western donors?" Traoré paused, turning to face her with the same calm intensity he had displayed throughout the panel. "Fear of consequences is what kept us silent for 60 years, he said simply. But silence in the face of injustice is not diplomacy. It is complicity. The world is changing. Young people everywhere are tired of polite lies and comfortable compromises. They want truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. But what about aid programs that might be cut in response to your comments?" The journalist pressed. "Don't you worry about the impact on your people?" For the first time since the confrontation, Traoré smiled, not smugly, but with genuine warmth. "My people have survived colonialism, structural adjustment programs, debt, crises, and decades of condescending assistance. We will survive the transition to dignity as well. In fact, we will thrive." The journalist scribbled notes frantically, recognizing that every word from this man would be analyzed and quoted for months to come. "Do you have a message for other African leaders watching this?" she asked. "The same message I have for leaders. Everywhere," Traoré replied. "Speak truth, serve your people. Remember that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through actions, not words." And with that, he walked away, leaving the journalist and a growing crowd of onlookers standing on the steps of the Geneva International Conference Center, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Within hours, the confrontation had exploded across every social media platform. The video clip was shared millions of times, dubbed and subtitled in dozens of languages. News networks around the world led their evening broadcasts with the story. Editorial writers struggled to capture the significance of the moment, while political analysts debated its long-term implications. In Washington, Trump's advisors worked frantically to craft a response that could somehow salvage the situation. But how do you respond to such precise, devastating criticism without seeming defensive or vindictive? In Africa, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. From Lagos to Cairo, from Johannesburg to Nairobi, people watched the video with a mixture of pride, amazement, and hope. Here, finally, was a leader who had said what they had been thinking for decades, but had never heard articulated so powerfully on such a stage. University students organized viewing parties. Social media influencers created reaction videos. Artists began creating murals and digital artwork inspired by the moment. The phrase, "I return both," became a rallying cry for dignity movements across the continent and beyond. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from other world leaders. In private conversations over the following days, Many admitted that Traoré's words had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own approaches to international relations. Some began quietly reassessing aid programs and diplomatic strategies, recognizing that the old models might no longer be sustainable in a world where young leaders were increasingly unwilling to accept disrespect, disguised as assistance. The confrontation in Geneva had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It marked the moment when the post-colonial order began to crack, when the assumption of Western moral authority started to crumble, when a new generation of leadership announced itself with clarity and courage. Ibrahim Traoré had come to Geneva as the president of a small, landlocked African country. He left as the voice of a movement, the embodiment of a new kind of leadership that refused to trade dignity for assistance, respect for resources, or truth for comfort. The world would never quite be the same, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, what happened next would prove that words, when spoken with absolute conviction, can indeed reshape reality. 3 days after Geneva, something unprecedented began to unfold. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the corridors of power where real decisions are made, far from cameras and microphones. In Berlin, Chancellor Scholz called an emergency meeting with his development ministers. The topic wasn't officially recorded, but sources close to the discussion later revealed that the German leader had been deeply affected by Traoré's words. We need to examine whether our aid programs actually empower recipients, or just make them more dependent on us, he was quoted as saying. Within a week, Germany announced a comprehensive review of its African development initiatives, with a focus on what they called dignity-centered partnership. Similar conversations were happening in capitals across Europe and North America. The French President Macron, who had sat frozen during the Geneva confrontation, privately admitted to his closest advisors that Traoré had articulated something we've all been trying to ignore. France began quietly restructuring its relationships with former African colonies, though they were careful not to frame it as a direct response to the Geneva incident, even in Washington, where Trump's team was still scrambling to manage the fallout. Career diplomats and development specialists began having frank conversations about whether America's approach to foreign aid was achieving its stated goals or simply perpetuating the problems it claimed to solve. But the real revolution was happening in Africa itself. In Accra, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo watched the Geneva video 3 times before calling his cabinet into emergency session. This young man has said what we've all been thinking for decades, he told his ministers. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Within days, Ghana announced its intention to renegotiate several aid agreements, particularly those that came with policy requirements that undermined national sovereignty. The Ghanaian finance minister was quoted as saying, "Aid should strengthen our capacity to govern ourselves, not weaken it." Similar movements began emerging across the continent. In Kenya, university students organized massive rallies supporting what they called the Dignity Doctrine. In Nigeria, the influential Afrobeat artist Burna Boy released a song called Return Both that sampled audio from Traoré's speech and quickly became an anthem for young Africans demanding respect from international partners. The social media explosion was unlike anything political observers had ever seen. The hashtag #ReturnBoth was trending in over 40 countries. But it wasn't just Africans sharing the content. Young people in Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe began using the phrase to challenge their own experiences with condescending aid and development policies. A particularly powerful moment came when a group of indigenous leaders from Latin America released a video response to Traoré's speech. "What you said in Geneva," declared Maria Santos, a Bolivian indigenous rights activist, "applies to every community that has been told they need to be saved by the very people who created their problems in the first place." The phrase, dignity-centered development, began appearing in academic papers, policy proposals, and UN documents. International development organizations found themselves scrambling to revise mission statements and program designs to address what was being called the Geneva Challenge. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré was experiencing a different kind of pressure. His phone rang constantly, with interview requests from major international media outlets: CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24. Everyone wanted to capture more of the magic that had electrified Geneva. But Traoré remained selective, agreeing only to interviews where he could discuss substantive policy alternatives rather than just replay the confrontation. In one particularly revealing interview with BBC's Zainab Badawi, he explained his philosophy. The goal was never to embarrass anyone or to reject all forms of international cooperation. The goal was to establish that cooperation must be between equals, not between benefactor and beneficiary. When you treat someone as perpetually needy, you rob them of the agency to become truly independent. But not everyone was celebrating. Western think tanks and policy institutes began publishing papers questioning whether Traoré's approach was realistic or sustainable. The Heritage Foundation released a report titled "The Dangers of Aid Nationalism," while the Council on Foreign Relations warned of rising anti-Western sentiment disguised as sovereignty movements. Corporate interests were particularly nervous. Mining companies, agricultural conglomerates, and pharmaceutical giants that had structured their African operations around aid-dependent relationships began seeing their business models challenged. Stock prices for several major corporations with significant African exposure dropped noticeably in the weeks following Geneva. The most dramatic corporate response came from Total Energies, the French oil giant that had extensive operations in West Africa. CEO Patrick Pouyanné held an emergency board meeting to discuss what he called the Traoré effect on their regional operations. Internal documents later leaked to the press revealed that the company was considering withdrawing from several African countries where they feared the new dignity politics might threaten their preferential agreements. This corporate anxiety wasn't unfounded. In Chad, President Mahamat Déby announced his government would be reviewing all extractive industry contracts to ensure they provided fair value for our resources and respect for our sovereignty. Similar announcements came from leaders in Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The economic implications were staggering. Bloomberg estimated that if even half of sub-Saharan Africa implemented the kind of sovereignty-first policies Traoré advocated, it could redirect hundreds of billions of dollars in resource revenues away from multinational corporations and toward national development programs. But perhaps the most telling response came from China, which had been quietly watching the entire drama unfold. Unlike Western powers, which had reacted defensively to Traoré's critique, Beijing saw an opportunity. Chinese officials began reaching out to African leaders, offering what they called true partnership based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. The Chinese approach was sophisticated. Rather than criticizing Western aid models directly, they simply offered alternatives. "We don't ask you to change your political systems," Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao told a gathering of African trade ministers. "We don't require you to adopt our values. We simply want to do business as equals." This put Western governments in an impossible position. The more they criticized Traoré's unrealistic demands for dignity and respect, the more they reinforced his argument that they saw African leaders as children incapable of making their own decisions. The more they insisted their aid came with no strings attached, the more obvious it became that those strings had always existed. Trump, meanwhile, was struggling with a crisis of political identity. His brand had always been built on projecting strength, on never backing down, on always having the last word. But Geneva had left him speechless, and the longer he remained silent, the more his silence was interpreted as concession. His advisors were split. Some urged him to double down, to attack Traoré more aggressively, and defend American aid programs more forcefully. Others argued that any response would just give more attention to the incident and make Trump appear defensive. The decision was made for him when Fox News host Tucker Carlson aired a segment titled "The Ingratitude of Ibrahim Traoré." The segment was meant to defend Trump and attack the Burkina Faso president, but it backfired spectacularly. Carlson's condescending tone and cherry-picked statistics about American aid to Africa only reinforced Traoré's original argument about Western paternalism. The backlash was swift and brutal. African-American leaders who had remained quiet during the original Geneva confrontation now spoke out forcefully. "When you dismiss an African leader's legitimate concerns about dignity and respect," said civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton, "you're not just attacking him. You're attacking the fundamental principle that all human beings deserve to be treated as equals." The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement supporting President Traoré's call for dignity-centered international relations. Several African-American celebrities, including Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan, used their platforms to amplify Traoré's message. Even more damaging for Trump was the reaction from younger Republican politicians who saw an opportunity to distance themselves from what they viewed as outdated approaches to international relations. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, often mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, gave a speech at Georgetown University calling for a new model of American leadership that empowers rather than patronizes our international partners. "The Geneva moment had created a political realignment that nobody had anticipated. Traditional left-right divisions seemed less relevant when the core issue was whether international relationships should be based on mutual respect or hierarchical dominance. This became even clearer when unexpected voices began supporting Traoré's position. Libertarian politicians who normally opposed foreign aid entirely found themselves praising his call for dignity and self-reliance. Progressive activists who typically supported increased development assistance began questioning whether such aid actually empowered recipients or just perpetuated dependency. The intellectual impact was equally profound. Universities began offering new courses on post-colonial development theory and dignity-centered international relations. Academic conferences that had previously focused on aid effectiveness began exploring questions of recipient agency and self-determination. A particularly influential paper published in Foreign Affairs by Harvard's Kennedy School argued that Traoré had identified a fundamental flaw in post-World War II international development thinking. "We have operated under the assumption that good intentions justify paternalistic methods," wrote Dr. Sarah Chen, the paper's lead author. "But as President Traoré demonstrated, the recipients of our help have their own perspectives on what constitutes genuine assistance versus subtle control." The business world was adapting too, but not always in ways Western corporations appreciated. A new generation of African entrepreneurs began building companies explicitly designed to reduce dependence on Western technology, financing, and expertise. The African Solutions for African Problems movement gained momentum, with successful startups in fintech, agriculture, and renewable energy, proving that the continent could indeed innovate and scale without perpetual external guidance. One particularly successful example was a Kenyan agricultural technology company that developed drought-resistant seeds specifically adapted to East African conditions. Instead of relying on Western research institutions and seed companies, they built partnerships with local universities and traditional farming communities. Within 2 years, their innovations were being adopted across the region, creating thousands of jobs and reducing food insecurity without requiring any foreign aid. Stories like this began appearing regularly in international business media, challenging the narrative that African development required Western intervention. The Economist published a cover story titled "Africa's Dignity Dividend," documenting how countries that embraced sovereignty-first policies were actually attracting more investment and achieving better development outcomes than those that remained aid-dependent. But the most powerful validation of Traoré's message came from an unexpected source: the next generation of African leaders themselves. In South Africa, Julius Malema, the controversial leader of the economic freedom fighters, organized a continental summit called Dignity and Development, Africa's New Path Forward. Despite Malema's often divisive rhetoric, the summit attracted moderate leaders from across Africa who were serious about implementing sovereignty-based development strategies. The summit's final declaration was remarkable for its specificity. Rather than just criticizing existing aid relationships, it outlined concrete alternatives: continental trade agreements that would reduce dependence on external markets, technology transfer programs that would build local capacity instead of perpetual reliance, and resource extraction policies that would ensure fair compensation for African natural wealth. Even more significantly, the summit announced the creation of an African Dignity Fund, a continental investment vehicle that would provide development financing without the policy conditions typically attached to Western aid. The fund was initially capitalized at $50 billion, with contributions from African governments, diaspora communities, and private investors who believed in the continent's potential for self-directed development. The fund's first major investment was in renewable energy infrastructure across the Sahel region, including Burkina Faso. But unlike typical development projects, this one was designed, implemented, and managed entirely by African institutions. The symbolism was as important as the practical impact. Africa was proving it could solve its own problems when given the resources and respect to do so. International reactions to these developments revealed the deep anxieties that Traoré's Geneva speech had exposed. Western media coverage was often dismissive, questioning whether African institutions had the capacity to manage such large-scale projects effectively. But these critiques only reinforced the original point about paternalistic attitudes. More thoughtful Western observers recognized that something fundamental was shifting. "What we're witnessing," wrote Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, "is not anti-Western sentiment, but pro-African confidence. There's a difference, and our ability to understand that difference will determine whether we remain relevant partners or become irrelevant observers." The transformation was happening at multiple levels simultaneously. While governments renegotiated aid agreements and corporations restructured African operations, ordinary citizens across the continent were internalizing a new sense of possibility and self-worth. In universities from Lagos to Addis Ababa, students began organizing Dignity Week celebrations, featuring discussions about post-colonial identity, economic sovereignty, and self-determination. These weren't angry, anti-Western rallies, but thoughtful explorations of what genuine partnership might look like. Perhaps most importantly, the conversations were spreading beyond Africa. In Bangladesh, student leaders began questioning why their country accepted development assistance that came with requirements to purchase goods and services from donor countries. In Bolivia, indigenous communities started demanding that international NGOs working in their territories operate as partners rather than benefactors. The Geneva Principles, dignity, sovereignty, mutual respect, and genuine partnership were becoming a global framework for rethinking international development relationships. 6 months after the confrontation, Ibrahim Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. The speech was highly anticipated, with world leaders curious to see whether he would maintain his confrontational approach or adopt a more diplomatic tone now that he had achieved global recognition. What they got was something more sophisticated than either extreme. Traoré used his UN platform not to attack Western aid policies, but to articulate a positive vision for what international cooperation could look like when based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical charity. "We do not reject partnership," he told the assembled delegates. "We reject paternalism. We do not refuse assistance. We refuse the assumption that assistance requires the surrender of dignity. We do not oppose cooperation. We oppose the idea that cooperation means some nations must always be givers, while others must always be receivers." The speech outlined specific policy proposals, technology transfer programs that built local capacity instead of perpetual dependence, trade agreements that allowed developing countries to add value to their resources before export, and investment frameworks that prioritized long-term partnership over short-term extraction. But the most powerful moment came at the end, when Traoré addressed the broader implications of the dignity principle. When we speak of dignity, we are not speaking only of Africa's relationship with the West. We are speaking of a fundamental principle that should govern all human interactions, the recognition that every person, every community, every nation has inherent worth that cannot be traded away for material benefit. This principle applies to indigenous communities in the Americas, to ethnic minorities in Asia, to working-class families in Europe and North America. Dignity is not an African issue, it is a human issue. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, led not just by African delegates but by representatives from across the global South and even some from developed countries who recognized the universal applicability of Traoré's message. In the year that followed, the dignity doctrine became a recognized framework in international relations theory. Law schools began teaching courses on dignity-based international law. Business schools offered programs on respect-centered global commerce. Even military academies started incorporating dignity principles into their training on international cooperation and peacekeeping. The Geneva confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its ripple effects continued to reshape international relations in ways that nobody could have predicted. Ibrahim Traoré had not just challenged Donald Trump, he had challenged an entire system of thinking about power, partnership, and human dignity that had dominated global politics for decades. The world had indeed changed, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed. But what comes next, when dignity confronts power on the global stage? What happens when entire continents refuse to trade respect for resources? And how does the international community adapt when the old rules of engagement are no longer acceptable? To a new generation of leaders who refuse to be grateful for their own diminishment? What do you think? When someone finally speaks the truth that everyone was thinking but nobody dared to say, does it change everything? And when dignity confronts arrogance on the world stage, can we all feel the ground shifting beneath our feet? Let us know in the comments what this moment means to you. And don't forget to subscribe, because next week, we're diving into what happened when Traoré walked into that French courtroom and faced down corporate power with nothing but truth and an unshakable sense of justice. The story you're about to hear will show you that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't violence or wealth, It's simply refusing to be silent when everyone expects you to stay quiet.